to the level of need that we're seeing here, that we're about to see, ensure that no one will lose their job due to COVID-19, and ensure that families will have the direct financial support they need to weather this difficult time.
I recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, with respect to losing their job due to self-isolating for 14 days, no one in this province will lose their job due to self-isolating themselves for 14 days. With respect to sick notes that may be requested by an employer here in Saskatchewan, we would truly hope that employers will not be considering that type of action given the global pandemic that we are facing here in our province and in our communities. And we would be hopeful that employers are most certainly taking a step forward to support their employees in their choice if they are required to self-isolate, Mr. Speaker. We want people to self-isolate. That is how we are going to be able to bend the curve, to flatten the curve, if you will, Mr. Speaker. And it is our expectation and our true hope that employers are going to participate in that, Mr. Speaker, and we will be engaging with our employment community over the next number of years, next number of days and weeks, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that our message is being heard by them. Right now, we are focused on restrictions, Mr. Speaker. Very shortly, we are continuing to focus on the resources that are made available, not only in healthcare services and services in our communities, but the resources that are being made available to not only the government of Saskatchewan's employees, but those in the private sector in this province as well.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The government has now made the decision to close Saskatchewan schools later this week. Will teachers, educational assistants, and other support staff continue to receive their salaries throughout this period of closure?
I recognize the Premier.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, they will. We have made what was a difficult decision, Mr. Speaker, with respect to winding down, if you will, the suspension of our classes here in the province. The teachers, our education staff will receive compensation during this period, Mr. Speaker, and we have allowed those, although the students will have their grades, we have allowed those that want to, and we hope all of them will continue with their opportunity to have access to that curriculum. They'll be supported by those teachers and their school divisions through some different methods of distance learning and alternative learning measures, Mr. Speaker, but for certain, our educators and our education community will be compensated in the days, weeks, and months ahead.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The decision to close schools has left many parents scrambling to find childcare or to make arrangements to be away from work. Not everyone can afford to use vacation time or to miss work. Will financial support be available for parents now that we've closed the schools?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, not just in the case of the education sector, but families right across this province. This is why this was such a challenging decision, Mr. Speaker, is now we have children that will not be going to school after the course of this week, Mr. Speaker. This is why we wanted to ensure that we still wanted our educators, our teachers, to provide those supports to students that want to continue with their curriculum and have access to that curriculum for the end of the year, but understanding that educators are parents as well, Mr. Speaker, and they have children that would either be in school or would also be in child care services here in the province. So again, Mr. Speaker, these are exactly the conversations that we are having today and into the future on how can we best support Saskatchewan families that in many cases are working together, leaning on one another to get through what is really an unprecedented situation. So, Mr. Speaker, we are looking at what type of resources the government of Saskatchewan would be able to provide in conjunction, quite likely, with the government of Canada as we work our way through the next number of weeks and months. Mr. Speaker, most certainly I would say this to the people of this province is this is a time for us to reach out. Not to touch one another, but to talk to one another, Mr. Speaker, and to support one another in our communities and in our province.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Finding childcare for kids who are out of school or out of daycare will be a challenge, particularly for those on the front lines providing essential service. So a couple of questions here. What communication has the province had with licensed childcare providers? Will they be closing in the coming days? And what is this government's plan for emergency childcare for people on the front lines, including healthcare workers who are essential in responding to COVID-19?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, as this is a situation that is evolving not only daily but in some cases hourly, and we saw that yesterday in a neighboring province of Alberta with a number of community transmissions of COVID-19, Mr. Speaker, of which we have had none yet in this province, Mr. Speaker. So the decision with respect to additional action when it comes to licensed childcare facilities in this province has not been made for today. However, I would say that may be a decision that we may have to address in the days and weeks ahead, Mr. Speaker. I think it's fair to say that all decisions and all actions may come to the table of not only the provincial government but the federal government as well, Mr. Speaker. We're going to continue to engage with our parents across this province to ensure that we are working with them to provide the supports that are necessary when they are needed.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Government of Ontario has announced that they will delay their budget. The federal government is delaying their budget as well. Clearly, despite assertions to the contrary, that is absolutely something that can be done here in Saskatchewan as well. The information in the budget scheduled for Wednesday is hopelessly out of date. We all know there will be much more to do to respond to the needs of Saskatchewan families. Our revenues have changed. Our spending priorities have to change, Mr. Speaker. Will the Premier postpone the budget and commit to working with leaders throughout the province to develop a plan to protect our economy from the effects of this pandemic? Will he shelve this out-of-date budget and work to bring forth a budget that's actually reflective of today?
Recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We'll be introducing a budget on Wednesday and beginning that budget debate, Mr. Speaker. This is a budget that is going to continue to invest in health care. It's going to a budget that is going to also have initiatives in it to ensure that, Mr. Speaker, as we find ourselves on the back slope of this curve, whenever that is, that we have every opportunity to rebuild the economy here in the province of Saskatchewan, Mr. Speaker. It's important that we move forward with this budget so that we are able to provide all of those supports and more if necessary. And I would also say this, with respect to formulating any type of a new budget, Mr. Speaker, it would be difficult to even begin that process given today's environment. The fact of the matter is we are going to move forward with the budget that we have before us. We feel it is a budget that needs to be introduced to the people of this province because of the supports for our health care, the supports for our education sector and our families, the supports, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we can rebuild the economy here in the province, Mr. Speaker. We'll be moving forward with that budget, Mr. Speaker, and we will commit to ensuring to be totally transparent as possible as the decisions that we make post-budget are made, whether they be on the investment side, Mr. Speaker, or whether they be on the revenue side, for certain by first quarter and quite likely even before that.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Introducing a budget that's completely divorced from the fiscal realities of today is a move that makes absolutely no sense. It is time to postpone that expired budget and work on something that's actually connected to today's reality, Mr. Speaker. This morning, the SHA's Chief Medical Health Officer indicated there are 100 ICU beds in the entire province, but that most of them are already occupied. This may not be enough if we see a spike in critically ill patients. My question to the Premier is this: how many ventilators are there in the province today? How many of them are currently used? And what's the plan to add capacity to the system in the event that current amount of beds and capacity isn't enough?
Recognize the Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I don't have the current number of ventilators that are available, Mr. Speaker, but I can say that on the phone call I was on last Friday with the Prime Minister and all of the other premiers from the 10 respective provinces and the 3 territories that we had discussions just specific to our supplies that we have in our healthcare centers and how we ultimately can apportion those if we need to and where we are sourcing those from, and is there an opportunity for us to work very closely together to ensure that we can source all of the personal protective equipment that we need in our healthcare centers, all of the ventilators that we need. And there is some challenges around ventilators around the world today, Mr. Speaker, as well as some of the other equipment ultimately that would be needed. So we're working collaboratively with other provinces and territories and our federal government on how we can ensure that we can source the supplies, the medical supplies that we will need in a timely fashion, not just here in Saskatchewan, but in other provinces as well, Mr. Speaker.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, it's important that we share this information with the public, and I'd ask the Premier to please come forward as soon as he's able with the number of ventilators, the number that are in current use, and what the modeling suggests in terms of need. When it comes to respirators or the N95 masks and other personal protective equipment, Mr. Speaker, ensuring that our healthcare workers have access to the proper equipment to care for patients is vital to avoid the spread of COVID-19. We're hearing concerns from frontline providers that there isn't sufficient personal protective equipment available. What is the government's plan to ensure that nurses, doctors, all healthcare workers have access to the appropriate respirators, gloves, gowns, face shields, and other equipment?
Recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you to the member of the opposition for that question. We're not aware of any shortages that have arrived or been communicated to the Saskatchewan Health Authority as of yet, Mr. Speaker. We do have a number of orders in for this personal protective equipment that we have worked with other provinces, territories, and the federal government on our expected need that we will have, Mr. Speaker, and we also have those orders in with a number of different suppliers around the world, understanding that other areas of the world have orders in as well, Mr. Speaker. So we're going to continue to work collaboratively with other partners in our federation here, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that we can all access the supply that we need. And to my understanding there, and to the Minister of Health's understanding, we have not had any shortages as of yet, and we're going to endeavour to continue to do everything that we can to ensure that that remains to be the case. Meanwhile, as we do that, Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, we continue to shift, if you will, the operations of the Saskatchewan Health Authority to scale back on some non-elective, non-emergent surgeries, some elective and non-emergent surgeries, Mr. Speaker, so that we can ensure that we have the capacity in our healthcare system, Mr. Speaker, should we need it in the days, weeks, and months ahead.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, what is the basis of the decision to not test non-travelers who display the symptoms of COVID-19 infection? Is this because there's a lack of concern about community transmission, or is it because there aren't enough swabs in the province to be able to do all of those tests?
I recognize the Premier.
Again, I jumped the queue there. Mr. Speaker, we have had no shortage with respect to the supplies needed for testing here in the province. If you look across Canada, there are provinces that have tested a number significantly more than Saskatchewan because they have a significantly larger population. And I would say also they also have international airports is where much of this has started, Mr. Speaker, with international either guests to Canada or people returning from international other nations have brought COVID-19 to Canada. And I would just say again that the 6 initial cases here in Saskatchewan, and I believe the 7th, are all connected in some way with travel, at least outside the province, Mr. Speaker. So to my knowledge, we have not had any shortages of any of the equipment that we have that is required either for testing or for treatment here in the province, Mr. Speaker, and we are making every effort and every attempt to ensure that that remains to be the case into the future.
Recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. When does the Premier expect that he'll be recommending non-essential business closures? And how will he be supporting Saskatchewan small businesses impacted by closure and decreased revenue as people are encouraged to stay home?
Recognize the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We heard the Prime Minister today talk about, if people don't need to go out, they should make the choice to stay at home. Mr. Speaker, the fact of the matter is this is an evolving situation. I said it evolves day by day. It at times even evolves hour by hour. We've seen that over the course of this weekend. We saw it over the course of even some of what occurred last week. So we continue to work very closely with the Chief Medical Officer here in the province, Mr. Speaker, with the Saskatchewan Health Authority, and with all of those involved to make the very best decisions, yes, on a day-by-day basis, but at times even on an hour-by-hour basis, Mr. Speaker. That's how we have conducted ourselves thus far, is with that collaborative effort, Mr. Speaker, and that's how we will continue to make decisions, whatever they may be about in the days and weeks ahead.
I recognize the Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. COVID-19 can affect anyone in the province, but some people are at greater risk. Indigenous people in Saskatchewan are especially vulnerable to the impacts of outbreaks, as many already face challenges of crowded housing, of underlying health challenges. What is the plan for the Premier to work with First Nations, Métis governments, tribal councils, and the FSIN to have a dedicated approach to reducing the impact of this virus on First Nations and Métis communities?
Recognize the Premier.
I'm just a little bit quick, which no one has said to me ever before, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, that is a good question with respect to not only our rural and remote communities in the north, our Indigenous communities. Also, we have a number of remote work camps, Mr. Speaker, in the mining industry and throughout northern Saskatchewan. So the fact of the matter is, specific to the Indigenous community, Mr. Speaker, I myself have been on the phone with Chief Bob Cameron a number of times over the course of the last few weeks, a few times over the course of the last few days, to ensure that the FSIN, I know some of my colleagues have been on the phone not only with Chief Cameron, but other Indigenous leaders as well, so that they are aware of the decisions that we are making. And at times, these are happening in quite rapid fashion, Mr. Speaker, without a lot of lead time, but to ensure they're aware of the decisions that we're making, and then working collaboratively as well, because some of these decisions they have to make, Mr. Speaker, in response to what we're doing here in the province. So this is a collaborative effort between communities, Aboriginal and otherwise, Mr. Speaker. It's a collaborative effort between industries, and it's a collaborative effort on behalf of all of the people of the province of Saskatchewan.
Ministerial statements. Introduction of bills. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. I'm advised that His Honour, the Lieutenant Governor, is here for royal assent. All please rise.
His Honour the Honourable Russ Braski, Lieutenant Governor of Saskatchewan.
Pray be seated. May it please Your Honour, this Legislative Assembly at its present session has passed several bills which in the name of the Assembly I present to Your Honour and to which bills I respectfully request Your Honour's assent.
Your Honor, the bills are as follows. Bill number 174, the Enforcement of Maintenance Orders Amendment Act 2019. Bill number 176, the Fiduciaries Access to Digital Information Act. Bill number 177, the Miscellaneous Statutes Electronic Register Amendment Act 2019. Bill number 175, the Marriage Amendment Act 2019. Bill number 188, the Public Guardian and Trustee Amendment Act 2019. Bill number 178, the Miscellaneous Statutes Repeal Act 2019. Bill number 190, the Expropriation Procedure Amendment Act 2019. Bill number 191, the Business Corporations Amendment Act 2019. Bill number 192, the Legal Profession Law Foundation Amendment Act 2019. Bill number 193, the Statute Law Amendment Act 2019, number 2. Bill number 205, the Children's Law Act 2019. Bill number 206, the Children's Law Consequential Amendments Act 2019. And Bill number 200, the Saskatchewan Employment Amendment Act 2019.
In Her Majesty's name, I assent to these bills.
Orders of the day.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 1, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 195, the Lobbyists Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Buck.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise this afternoon and enter into the debate around Bill number 195, the Lobbyist Amendment Act. Mr. Speaker, this bill makes several changes. One of the most important changes to this bill and most significant is the reduction of the threshold for registration as an in-house lobbyist from 100 hours to 30 hours. Mr. Speaker, there is still an exemption for nonprofit charitable organizations with less than 5 employees who lobby for a total of less than 30 hours annually from registering as an in-house lobbyist, which I think is important to keep that exemption. However, the reduction is a positive step forward. Mr. Speaker, we believe that it's not quite enough, and we would like to see that the reduction of, or the hours required to register be reduced, frankly, to 0 if possible, to ensure as much transparency as possible in who is lobbying our government. Mr. Speaker, this is important for democracy and it's important for transparency in governmental decisions. I believe the member from Saskatoon Centre is the critic for this bill. If not, either he or myself will be speaking to members of committee on this piece of legislation. Either way, I know we're both looking forward to it, and to allow that to happen, I'm prepared to allow this bill to move on to its next stage.
Question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 195 be now read a second time. Pleasure to the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I designate that Bill number 195, the Lobbyist Amendment Act 2019, be committed to the Committee of Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 2, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 196, the Members' Conflict of Interest Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Verma.
Recognize the member for Regina Douglas Park.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my honor to rise this afternoon and enter into the debate around Bill number 196, the Members' Conflict of Interest Amendment Act. This bill makes several changes. Most notably, I think, Mr. Speaker, is the change that requires that a description of the assets of any private companies controlled by a member or a member's family be included in the disclosure statements. Mr. Speaker, this is to allow an increased measure of transparency in the disclosure statements of members. Often you'll see numbered companies listed in the disclosure statements, but that doesn't provide any sort of understanding of what type of business that that company is a part of or what kind of assets are being held under that particular numbered company, Mr. Speaker. So this is a path forward in terms of transparency and accountability. Mr. Speaker, I think it's also important that not only members but members' families' assets be included in that, which is in this change. I know my colleague, the member for Saskatchewan Centre, will have many questions about not just this provision but other provisions and what we can be doing moving forward in terms of increasing disclosure and transparency in our disclosure statements as a step forward toward further democracy in our government and in our represented officials, Mr. Speaker. To allow my colleague to have the opportunity to ask questions about this bill to officials, I am prepared to allow this bill to now move forward to its next stage.
Question before the Assembly is a motion by the Minister that Bill number 196 be now read a second time. It's the pleasure of the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Second reading of this bill.
To which committee shall this bill be committed? Recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I designate that Bill number 196, the Members' Conflict of Interest Amendment Act 2019, be committed to the Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
This bill stands committed to the Standing Committee on Intergovernmental Affairs and Justice.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 3, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 197, the Automobile Accident Insurance Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Witherspoon.
Recognize the member for Prince Albert Northcote.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm looking forward to putting some of my remarks on the record with regards to Bill number 197. There's a lot of changes that are going to be implemented with this bill, and so it'll be very interesting when this comes to committee so that we can have more discussion on it. Some of the changes are with regards to the appeal system. So it looks like there'll be some changes on how appeals will happen, and there'll be questions with regards to if this is going to be a change that it is going to be more convenient for SGI, or if it's going to be more convenient for the individuals who would be placing the claim appeal in. So I know there'll be a lot of questions on that, as well as how many appeals are made and how that will impact cases, or if this will have a very little impact. So there'll be a lot of questions with regards to that. And who requested these changes? Was it something that customers were requesting, or was this something that SGI wanted to put forward? So there'll be some questions in committee with regards to that. Also, there'll be some changes on housekeeping items, but also some language and terminology. And the minister indicated this was to make it more clear with regards to the legislation. And so, but sometimes when we change language, we've got to see if it's going to be an efficient change as well. Also, there's some changes with regards to a person's license when it's surrendered. And so there'll be a lot of questions with regards to that on how this is enforced within the province, but also outside of the province. So if a person's license is surrendered here, if they go apply for a license outside the province, what that entails, how will they know that this is happening, or if someone's license is suspended outside the province when they renew their license here, how are we informed about that? So again, there's quite a few changes here within a lot of the legislation. I'm hoping once this gets to committee, some of the regulations will also be included in that, so there could be more answers to some of the changes that's going to be happening here. But with that, Mr. Speaker, I don't have much more I want to discuss now. I'll bring my comments to committee, and with that, I'm going to adjourn the debate on Bill number 197. Adjourn.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure to assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 4, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 198, the Traffic Safety Amendment Act 2019. Ms. Sarn.
Recognize the member for Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, to join in on Bill number 198, the Traffic Safety Amendment Act 2019. I know that SGI has ran quite the campaign about making people aware about distracted driving, using cell phones, handheld devices, about the impact of injuries, collisions, and the loss of life from people distracted from, cell phones, handheld devices, and I guess distracted driving overall. And they had quite the campaign, and I think trying to make people aware. And I know SGI has asked the province, and of course, to come up with stiffer penalties, and they have done that. We've seen, I believe, about February of this year, we've seen distracted driving using a handheld device in your hand. The fine will be doubled. You get caught a second time, it goes up quite a bit actually. And I just looking at some of the fees, I guess it goes to $580 on your first time offense, and then if you go a second time, it goes to $1,400 within a certain time, and $2,100 if you're caught within a year a third time. And then obviously they're talking about impounding someone's vehicle because they're taking it serious to send a message out there to people in light of the campaign and awareness. I guess we're hearing by the amount of tickets and infractions and loss of life and injury and damage that has occurred that the government is taking a stand as well as being recommendation. And I'm assuming it's coming mainly from SGI, of the concerns that they're dealing with. And probably individuals, who have been in an incident or an accident, and somebody, they know was distracted using a cell phone, or for whatever reason, distracted a driver. So I'm not going to get into a lot of this. It makes it very clear they're taking it serious, and taking some more action to try to make the public aware of how serious the infraction is of using a handheld device, or just undue care and attention, and the fines. And I think it's important to say that they do have the ability now to impound a vehicle, and I think that's going to send a strong message. Hopefully, anything you can do to save one life, and I think SGI has asked that. I know my colleague will have more questions in committee about some of it, and maybe get some of the information from the officials when the committee comes together to do. So I don't have a lot more to say. I know that we see this as from the side of it as stronger penalties, and trying to make the awareness with SGI how serious it is, and hopefully we will do the work we need to. So at this point, we're prepared to, or I'm prepared to adjourn debate on Bill 198.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 5, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 199, the Opioid Damages and Healthcare Cost Recovery Act. Ms. Sarr.
I recognize the member for Regina Rosemont.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll enter in briefly here this afternoon with respect to the Bill number 199, the Opioid Damages and Healthcare Cost Recovery Act 2019, but want to offer in that brief entry full support for this very important action. Certainly to thank all that are involved in this legal effort to go after some of those individuals that and companies that have brought incredible harm to people of our province, to the people of our country, Mr. Speaker. And so to join this effort along with BC and other jurisdictions is incredibly important to go after those that have manufactured and distributed opioids that have killed and devastated and stolen so many people from our province, Mr. Speaker, have stolen loved ones from far too many families, and of course have come at a tremendous cost to the healthcare system as well, by way of very expensive hospitalization, certainly expensive treatment as well, Mr. Speaker, all the economic impacts that are attached to opioid addiction, and in our case in Saskatchewan, crystal meth addiction as well, Mr. Speaker. So I attach just the highest level of support to this action against these predatory actions and behaviors of these companies, these actors in the opioid industry, Mr. Speaker, and stand as a full constructive ally for this effort and any way we can further aid this effort, Mr. Speaker. Quite simply, opioids and crystal meth addictions within our province have ravaged the lives of far too many in this province, Mr. Speaker. And this is an epidemic and a crisis that we're dealing with right now within this province, Mr. Speaker. Certainly, we're well on the record with the slow actions of government to respond to that epidemic and to the needs of people, and to respond with timely and appropriate treatment for individuals, and to fix our broken mental health and addiction services, Mr. Speaker. And we'll continue to push government for the needed action on those fronts. But this bill before us here today is an important measure, and one we support fully, Mr. Speaker, one I support fully. I just want to share, Mr. Speaker, that last year in Regina, there were 82 overdoses in Regina. That's a terrible number. It's a terrible human cost, Mr. Speaker. But in Regina, in just the last 2 months, just over the last 2 months to the current time, we have over 100, Mr. Speaker. 82 in all of last year, which is a number that is way higher than it should be and represents terrible hurt and harm and tragedy within lives, Mr. Speaker. But in the last couple months, Mr. Speaker, we've had over 100 overdoses. I've lost 2 constituents for certain, Mr. Speaker, in the last 2 months to this terrible addiction that's killing our community members, that's stealing family members from loved ones. And we need to be united in the fight against those drug dealers, Mr. Speaker, the opioid manufacturers and distributors, Mr. Speaker, and be tough as hell with them, Mr. Speaker, and to fight them with every legal means that we have. But we also have to marshal the resources that we have within this province, and to take up our roles and the duty that we have as members of this Assembly to give voice and to call for the needed action to save lives and to extend treatment and to fix this broken mental health and addiction services, Mr. Speaker. That being said, I'll adjourn debate with respect to Bill number 199, the Opioid Damages and Healthcare Cost Recovery Act 2019.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 6, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 201, the Alcohol and Gaming Regulation Amendment Act 2019. Mr. McCall.
Recognize the member for Regina Lakeview.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise this afternoon to speak to Bill number 201, the Alcohol and Gaming Regulation Amendment Act. I think I'm not speaking to anything that anyone here isn't feeling by saying that it seems a bit surreal to stand up and to speak to anything other than those concerns that are front of mind right now. Across at some point, we will be past this, and there are people who I'm sure who are watching the progress of this bill because it will have impacts upon them and their livelihood, their job, and around the way that liquor is warehoused in the province. So I will be rather brief with my comments because I think I just want to hit them straight on, but there are some questions and some concerns that we do have here. First of all, the bill authorizes the SLGA to enter into agreements with any person for warehousing and delivery of specialty liquor products. This is a change, Mr. Speaker, whereby right now we have warehousing of some beer products, but not of the specialty liquor products. Of course, this is a further step to some of the earlier measures that we've seen with regard to the privatization of how liquor is distributed in the province. Some of the early days of being elected to this assembly sat in on committee where we heard submissions and concerns from the public about those changes. So certainly I do remember a number of those concerns. Some of them would attach themselves to this further move towards privatization, and some of those concerns that people did stipulate in that committee have come to be true. Some, perhaps further changes we might see later this year or later in the fall, depending. It seems like our timelines now are all a bit up in the air, Mr. Speaker, but that commitment to the existing SLGA stores, I believe, was due to expire later this year. We'll be waiting to see what happens there. This also creates a penalty. I'll go back. This clarifies that only retail store permittees will be able to purchase alcohol directly from a person with whom SLGA has entered an agreement. So some stipulations around that initial move towards allowing for this warehousing, and it creates penalties subsequent to that for a person who refuses to produce identification to a liquor permittee, and creates an offence to having or keeping out beverage alcohol not purchased from or through the SLGA. So sort of the major change, and then some changes through there. I did note in the minister's second reading remarks that the SLGA, the province, will still take, I can't remember, they will take a fee off of all of liquor markups through the third-party warehouses, but I think that's not where the centre of the concerns arises from. It's around the privatization, the further privatization of liquor in the province. One of the concerns that has been noted by others of my colleagues, but I think I will enter into register those same concerns here, or those questions, are around a document called the Canadian Alcohol Policy Evaluation. Mr. Speaker, this was an evaluation that was meant to look at the use and misuse of alcohol in this country, and some of the fallout from that, things like impaired driving charges. Of course, we know here in this province that's something that remains high, and is something we should be taking every measure to reduce. I know measures have been taken, but those rates do remain stubbornly high. Within that Canadian alcohol policy evaluation, there were two main recommendations. One was reducing the hours of operation of liquor stores. I know this has been a concern in some individual communities. They've taken measures to reduce the hours that alcohol can be purchased within those communities, with an eye towards reducing some of those social impacts that are seen, drinking and driving and other concerns. But also the second recommendation is around reducing privatization. I think the public sector does a very good job of those roles of regulation, carding, and ensuring that procedures are met. Often you have people who are in the same job for many, many years, and there's less turnover within those jobs. I can't speak to whether or not that is an issue in the private sector, but I do know that this is something that the public sector does very well. I think the minister also mentioned in his comments that this might improve the availability of some of those specialty liquor products, and perhaps that's a goal that we have, and maybe that is the case. I do know within the existing SLGA warehouse system, if they're not able to get something, they're often able to order it in, and often in very, very short order. So just a plug out to those who do that work and within the public liquor stores, and are always there to give advice and recommendations. I don't think, if I continue on, I'm going to be uncovering any new concerns. I think most of our concerns and questions about this bill, at least that we're going to have within this Assembly, have made their way on the record. As always, I suspect that the critic will have additional information and have reached out to stakeholders with regard to this bill, and may have further questions and concerns in committee, but I think I will leave that business to her. And with that, I am in a position to wrap up my remarks and adjourn debate on Bill number 201.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders adjourn debates. Item number 7. Resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 203, the Financial Planners and Financial Advisors Act. Ms. Rancourt.
Recognize the member for Cumberland.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Bill number 203, the Financial Advisors Act. Mr. Speaker, people have hard earnings that they work hard for, and they invest in for their retirement. They want to make sure that the government is putting in regulations and legislation that, again, protects them and tries to protect their hard-earned dollars when they give it or hand it over to an investing company or someone to be there. And what this legislation does, what I can see, and I know I'm not going to get into it lots, but what it looks like, it makes sure that whether you're a financial planner or financial advisor, you're making sure that you have the education, the accreditation that it requires you to go ahead and meet with Saskatchewan residents and say you're a financial planner or a financial advisor, that you've got the education and accreditation to be serving clients and providing the services that they need. So I know my colleagues will have more questions and finding out where this came from as far as if there's been problems that have been identified that, and I don't know if the process worked before, how one would do it, if it was just that there wasn't legislation that gave teeth to making sure somebody had the accreditation or the education. So we'll see exactly in committee why this came forward, but obviously to protect Saskatchewan residents, as I said earlier, who work hard and want to make sure their retirement dollars and dollars that they have for education, for their grandkids maybe, for their retirement, they want to make sure that those dollars are, whoever they're dealing with has accreditation or the education. So at this point, I don't have a lot more to say. I know my colleagues will have more in committee and will ask the questions of the right people at the time in committee. So I'm prepared to adjourn debate on this bill.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure to somebody to adopt the motion. Carried.
Government orders, adjourn debates. Item number 8, resume debate on the second reading motion for Bill number 204, the Jury Amendment Act 2019. Mr. Forbes.
Recognize the member for Regina Elphinstone Centre.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. It's good to join debate this afternoon on Bill number 204, the Jury Amendment Act 2019. In its introduction, it was great to hear the French language on the part of the Deputy Clerk at the time of its introduction. I'm not sure what face you're making for me there, Mr. Speaker. If it's okay, carry on. All right, we'll just have at her. But, Mr. Speaker, this comes forward on the heels of a multi-year review of the jury management system. In terms of the changes on offer, there are changes to the selection and summoning process. There's an exclusion provided in the legislation around the ability of chiefs and council members of First Nations from service as jurors. This is the same practice that is afforded currently to reeves, mayors, city councillors, Mr. Speaker. And in terms of what happens with the spouses of reeves, mayors, and city councillors, it in turn opens them up for inclusion in the pool of prospective jurors, recognizing that in certain regions in the province, you want to have as many people available to that jury pool selection process as possible, and that we're all our own person, and it's nice to see that recognized, Mr. Speaker. In terms of excluding individuals who have been sentenced to 2 or more years and have not been pardoned from service as jurors, and there's also an authorization around the electronic impaneling of a jury. Mr. Speaker, I know for a fact that I have learned colleagues who have much more legal expertise than I and much more experience with the jury process, Mr. Speaker. Me, it's a little more rudimentary than that. I'm not going to refer you to my great interest in various legal proceedings that came forward in such great shows as The Flintstones and, Law and Order. But, Mr. Speaker, it's been good reading the bill, good reading the minister's second reading speech. Good to hear the use of the French language in the introduction of this particular item. And of course, the langue française, it's very important in these matters as well, so that we can all be full citizens under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Mr. Speaker, and enjoy our pursuit of peace, order, and good government, or a good life in this province of ours. But I'll not belabor it any more than that, Mr. Speaker, other than to add my own sort of sense of surreality in terms of having a few words to say on a matter such as this, on a day such as this as well, Mr. Speaker. But with that, I would move to adjourn debate on Bill number 204, the Jury Amendment Act 2019.
Members move to adjourn debate. Pleasure the Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. Good. Recognize the Deputy Government House Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I move that this House do now adjourn.
Move that this House do now adjourn. Pleasure Assembly to adopt the motion. Carried. This House stands adjourned until tomorrow at 1:30 p.m.